Hey, there's no loudspeaker, not working.
Hello, can you hear me?
Louder.
Is that better?
Not quite.
Good afternoon. Right, okay. Just to give you a bit of background about myself, I currently work for a company called Parexel International, who are a CRO, a clinical research organisation. They also have a sub-function unit, Parexel Consulting, and I work for that sub-function unit, and I specialise more in the area of post-approval marketing, the regulatory affairs of post-approval marketing. And so I thought I'd share with you just my opinion and experience of what regulatory intelligence is within the regulatory affairs sector of the pharmaceutical industry. And I've called it industry's best practice because I think it should be industry's best practice, especially if you are a regulatory affairs professional. And I've actually been within regulatory affairs over the last 10 years, and I'm still learning. I still believe I'm still quite new to regulatory affairs, although I still have the 10 years experience. So if I just start then just with the agenda. So I'll do a brief introduction on the regulatory intelligence. Then I'll talk about the definitions of the regulatory intelligence, and then I will do analysis based on my opinion of the definitions, and then do a brief summary. So I hope you can hear me okay now. Is that better okay? So just to start with an introduction, so basically regulatory intelligence, also known as RI or Reg Intel, as some industries call it, some companies call it, I believe it's been practiced in some way or other from when regulations first came into existence. And so in recent years, RI has become more of a phenomena in the pharmaceutical regulatory sector. And although the concept is still evolving, there are two definitions that have been created for regulatory intelligence. One has been created by the Drug Information Association Regulatory Intelligence Network Group, also known as DIA Ring, and then the second definition has been created by the EU Regulatory Intelligence Group, also known as EU Ring. And so the next slide, I have actually presented both definitions side by side. So just to basically go through those definitions, the Drug Information Association definition is basically the act of gathering and analysing publicly available regulatory information. This includes communicating the implications of that information and monitoring the current regulatory environment for opportunities to shape future regulations, guidance, policy and legislation. Okay, so the EU definition of regulatory intelligence is the regulatory intelligence is the act of processing targeted information and data from multiple sources, analysing the data in its relevant context and generating a meaningful output. So, for example, outlining risks and opportunities to the regulatory strategy. The process is driven by business needs and linked to decisions and actions. And so the next slide, I will start to go through these definitions by analysing them. And I'll start with the DIA Ring definition. So if I go through the first part of the DIA definition, the act of gathering and analysing publicly available regulatory information. So I just want to explain, in my opinion, what that means. So the act of gathering and analysing publicly available regulatory information, so where is that publicly available regulatory information? Where will that come from? So I've listed a number of sources where to get that information. And so you'll have the regulatory authority websites, such as the EMA, European Medicine Agency, the FDA, TGA, which is the Australian Therapeutic Goods Authority, and also NCA, which are the national competent authorities within the European community, and also worldwide, internationally. Another source to gather and analyse publicly available regulatory information are regulatory journals, newsletters, also conferences, meetings, networking from your consultants, colleagues, groups on LinkedIn. And have to say that there are a number of groups in LinkedIn that you can join, and I've actually learned a lot from those groups, just from different backgrounds and experiences, and basically gathering regulatory information. And also, these last two sources of information, which I think are very important when you're gathering and analysing publicly available information, are executing a gap analysis of what data you already have and what is missing, and also conducting regulatory surveys. So basically you're asking a series of regulatory implication questions. So I'll talk a bit more about that in my presentation tomorrow. So that's the first part of the DIA ring, the first fragment. If you look at the next segment, which is, this includes communicating the implications of that information. And so what I'd like to say about that section of the DIA definition is that how do you communicate the implications of that information, and who do you communicate with? So basically I'd like to consider, as I mentioned in my previous slide, the gap analysis. That will be your form of communication. So you've done your gap analysis, what data is available, what is missing, and also from the regulatory surveys that you have conducted, where you've asked a series of regulatory implication questions. So just to give you a very quick example of the regulatory surveys, if your company were to make a change to the drug licence in a number of countries where that drug is marketed, then you have to, well, in my experience, I've done a number of surveys where I have asked a number of questions. What will be that regulatory implication, if there is one? What documentation will be required for submitting to the health authorities to make that change to your drug? And then also communicating the implications of the information you have gathered. You will then need to communicate that to your business functions such as marketing, quality and supply chain, as there may be an impact on those business areas. And so if I then take the final segment of the DIA definition, which is monitoring the current regulatory environment for opportunities to shape future regulations, guidance, policy and legislation. So I just want to give you my thoughts on what that means. So basically, how do you achieve this? How do you monitor the current regulatory environment for opportunities? So my first bullet point, that talks about, well, you've already achieved this in the first part of the definition, where you've gathered and analysed publicly available regulatory information. And then next point is that access to regulatory authorities' public consultation. So many public consultations are published by the health authorities, and you can give your basically opinions on any future changes within the regulations and guidance and policies. And then also challenging current guidelines. And I know Dr. Michael Drews, you've spoken about this quite a lot. So challenging guidelines, if you have a better course of action with a justification, then you need to communicate that with your regulatory authority. But in order to do that, you need to actually understand what the guideline is, what it's asking you to do. So that's a very good point about communicating and monitoring the current regulatory environment. And the final one, which is what all regulatory affairs professionals should be doing anyway, just keep abreast of new regulations and any impact they can have on existing directives. So just to give you an example on that, with the advancement of the stem cell therapy, there's also in the EU, there's no particular regulation on what impact that will have on the Medical Devices Directive, because there is the aspect of combination products there, and there's no specific guidelines in the EU regarding combination products in that sense. So if I then move on to the EU RING definition and look at that in its fragments, so just break down the definition. So the EU definition then, the first fragment talks about regulatory intelligence is the act of processing targeted information and data from multiple sources. Very similar to the DIA definition. So what I've said for this segment of the EU definition is that it's more specific than the first leg of the DIA RING definition, which talks about just gathering and analysing publicly available regulatory information, whereas the EU is more about targeting specific information and data. And to give you an example, as I mentioned earlier, if you're doing a variation to change the formulation of a drug product that's already licensed in the Asia-Pacific market, so that's you're only targeting information or data for that particular change within that market. And so just to continue with this aspect, this segment of the EU definition, data can be from multiple sources, as I mentioned in my previous slide, from regulatory authorities, regulatory journals, newsletters, conferences, meetings, consultants, colleagues, groups on LinkedIn, and doing the gap analysis and also the regulatory surveys. Okay, so if I move on to the second part of the EU definition, analysing that data in its relevant context and generating a meaningful output, so for example, outlining risks and opportunities to the regulatory strategy. So what does that exactly mean? So basically, I've just given some points on my thoughts on this. So for example, as previously mentioned, data for changing the formulation of your drug product, how can that data be analysed to prepare a regulatory strategy and risk analysis to make the change? Well, you've got to consider the markets impacted. Where is that drug registered? Which markets will be impacted with this change to the drug formulation? What type of regulatory change will it be? What documentation are required for the submission package, the time frame for approval, and when can the change be implemented, and what impact that will have on commercial quality and supply chain within the business. And so, moving on to the final part of the EU definition, the process is driven by business needs and linked to decisions and actions. So, basically, I've given my opinion on what I believe that is. So if we take the previous example, changing the formulation of a drug product, what possible business needs will drive the regulatory intelligence process? It will improve quality of the drug, possibly reduce the cost of manufacturing the drug, and increase the productivity, so make it a better manufacturing process, more efficient. So basically, just to summarise now, I've just broken down the EU and the DIA definition. This is just a summary of basically what of the points I have just gone through. So what I'd like to say is that however you interpret the definitions I have just explained, RI key aspects is applying the acquired knowledge from drug discovery to post-approval. And I think a vast amount of years and cost is invested in getting the drug on the market, and then once it's on the market, what happens next? And I think that's where some companies tend to neglect their well-established products. So that's when I believe that the importance of RI ensures the best regulatory strategy so that your drugs safety, quality and efficacy is maintained during its life cycle, and so basically keeping your drug on the market and ensuring it complies with the current regulations. So that's just a summary then. And then I want to just briefly summarise what I believe is the RI process. So if I start with the regulatory intelligence aspect and then explain the various steps that do make up the regulatory intelligence. So basically, for me, data collection is one aspect of the regulatory collection. You're collecting all your data from various sources, such as the health authority sites. And then once you've got that data, you need to analyse that data. What does it exactly mean? How can you basically manipulate the data, use it to your advantage? And then you can look at any risk assessment. So basically, if you are doing a change to your drug product and you want to do it in the most quickest time and not have any delays, look at any risks that may happen along the way during the time when you make that change, submit it to the health authorities. So, for example, there will be delays in not understanding what the regulations are from the start. So this is why it's important to do a risk assessment and minimising those risks. And then you can actually put a regulatory strategy together once you have identified any risks. And then you need to communicate that then to health authorities, with assessors prior to making any submissions, communicate with your company, get them on board, the management, senior management, so that they understand what impact that will have on the business. And so then we move on to the application. And for me, the application is actually making that change. So if you are changing your drug license, you do that submission, and that's a final stage in this process. So they're my contact details, and I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.